Hello everyone and welcome back. We are live with Teachers Talk Radio, the Schools and Academies show in Birmingham, and I'm delighted to be joined by Joe Brassington, who's here. And Joe, do you want to tell us what you're doing here today?
Sure, good morning. I'm here today. I was speaking on a panel about how we get inclusion right in safeguarding, particularly around LGBTQ plus people. So how we look at our safeguarding policies, procedures, and our training for our staff, and make sure that it is inclusive of LGBT people.
What are the challenges that you think are around at the moment?
I think one of the biggest challenges is teachers' perceptions. The majority of people working in our schools at the moment, and certainly the majority of people leading in our schools, were educated in a time where our education system wasn't inclusive. And there was a specific policy in place to ensure that it wasn't inclusive. So whether we're aware of it or not, we all have these preconceived ideas of what a school should look like, which are based on our own experiences. So I think that the challenge is encouraging teachers and those working in educational spaces to reimagine what inclusion looks like in an educational space. And I think that starts off with, I was just speaking about how important it is to establish a common inclusion goal in your school that you all agreed on. So the one that we suggest at Pride and Progress is that we want every person in our school community to feel that they can be themselves, feel safe, feel seen and supported, and feel like they belong here. And surely as educators, we all agree with that. So with that common inclusive goal, that's when we can start to have the conversations that are a bit more difficult around language or around LGBT inclusion.
What sort of inspired you personally to set all this stuff up and do what you're doing?
In my fourth year of teaching, a child in my class at the time shouted some pretty awful homophobic and transphobic things at me in front of my class. And up until that moment, I hadn't really ever thought about being open in school or why it might matter. But in that moment, I kind of realized if I was silent about that, then I was teaching that was acceptable. So I came out to my class for the first time that day. I had a conversation about my identity, and it was such a good conversation. Kids are great. And from then, I kind of started to have wider conversations about actually how important that visibility and representation is, and how we can make all teachers aware of why that's important.
Yeah. Do you think there's sort of any pushback against you from within the sector?
I think one of the key challenges that we face at the minute is that the rhetoric within the media and within certain government officials is anti-trans and is transphobic. We're seeing a lot of kind of what we saw in the 80s towards gay and lesbian people being mirrored in conversations around trans and non-binary people now. And I think that impacts people's perceptions of what is or isn't acceptable. But fortunately, there is legislation in place that is a backup for us. So the Equality Act, the new RSC guidance. We were just talking then about how in the updated version of Keeping Children Safe in Education, there's a specific paragraph around LGBT plus people, and it is LGBT. The T is very clearly there. So really, whether there's pushback or not, it's statutory now. It's in the Keeping Children Safe in Education Act that we make those safe spaces for people.
What do you think some of the sort of policies that schools have, not all schools, but what do you think are some policies that sort of might run against some of the things that you think should be happening? You know, give me some examples of some sort of, whether it be policies, whether it be philosophies, whether it be, you know, I remember on TTR, it's a couple of months back now, we had a debate about, it wasn't really a debate, but a discussion around toilets and the provision for toilets. So I was wondering, what are the issues that you think, are there any policies that you think run against what you're saying?
Yeah, and it goes back to that thing that so many of our school buildings were built in a time when our education wasn't inclusive, and so many of our staff were educated in a time where it wasn't inclusive. So there's so many things that are. So the legislation that stopped LGBT inclusion in schools was repealed in 2003, but they kind of repealed it and took it away. But those things are still deeply rooted into our schools. So it's how we start to unroot those. And I think you're right. Toilets is one of them. Changing rooms is one of them. the conversation around school trips and how we navigate that with trans people. Our schools are very gendered spaces, more gendered than society is more broadly often. So there are lots of conversations about the physical space and how we get that right. And I think it's really important that we think about individual cases in that situation. We always say there are as many ways to be a woman as there are women, as many ways to be a man as there are men, and there are as many ways to be a trans person as there are trans people. So different children will require different things, and if you want your school to be an inclusive space, you've got to get that culture right, but also make space for those conversations with an individual about actually the toilets we have aren't working for you. What can we do? What reasonable adjustments can we put in place to support you? Or we're going on this school trip, the accommodation is segregated. What reasonable adjustments can we put in place to support you? And having those conversations with individual young people that need that extra support is really important.
Sounds really good work, really interesting. Thanks for sharing it. Wish we had more time, but we don't. But maybe at some point you can come back on TTR and tell us more about everything.
Sure, thanks for having me. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers, Joe. Bye-bye.